Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today we are talking about something quite new in the world of American whiskey and whiskey in general. We're talking to Chase Langdon, Devin Ershow. Is that right?
Ershow.
Ershow. Okay. There's one or the other, and I always go the other 50%. From American Mash and Grain, also recently putting out Borrowed Page American whiskey, which we will definitely be talking about a bit. So, Chase, Devin, welcome.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Appreciate it, David.
So, Devin, as I was saying to Chase before you came on, I had to kind of radically redo the outline I had for this episode because I listen to other episodes and read interviews and such before doing these. And you were just on with my friend John over at Embellish Pod, and he asked a lot of the questions that I had on my list. So I had to come up with some new ones, some new angles to take. Thankfully, Devin, when you were on with Alan Bishop, it wasn't as many questions that I had, so those that'll stand alone. But um, it's all good. It all works out in the end. So instead of starting with Borrowed Page, I want to instead start with American Mash and Grain. You know, really the platform, the website, and most importantly, let's just start with how did that come about with the two of you?
Well, it really starts a very long time ago in kindergarten in Princeton, New Jersey, where a young Chase and a young Devin got into a squabble over the place in line to go out to recess. And we were subsequently benched, which at our school was the punishment for doing bad things, which meant that we had to sit on a bench that faced the playground so that we could look at the other kids playing while we sat next to the teachers. Fortuitously, though, we got to actually talk to each other on the bench and became good friends. And 25 plus years later, I won't give anybody the specific year, but 25 plus years later, here we are, still best friends. And a lot of what American Mash and Grain started off with was, it was the middle of the pandemic. I was sort of working on the outskirts of whiskey in part-time roles for a couple different craft distilleries. I wanted to get more involved with whiskey. I wasn't sure how to do that. And it was Chase that sort of came up with the original concept. So I'll let him take over for me there.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea was, Devin talked about his motive, right? Motivation was to kind of figure out how to go further down this rabbit hole of whiskey. That was not really my intent at the beginning. I was really just looking for, in the midst of COVID, when we're so isolated and we couldn't go see people or do anything, find a way to reconnect and invest some time with my friends. And so I kind of came up with this concept. It was like, well, what if we started this kind of holistic storytelling platform, a blog website that focused specifically on the craft movement, where Devin had, some connections and, is really just kind of this interesting developing space. He could bring his whiskey knowledge. I work in brand marketing, storytelling, and sales. And so I could bring that piece in and really, it served a lot of purposes, right? He can kind of further develop his professional network in whiskey. And I would have a chance really just to drink whiskey and get on a Zoom call, every couple of weeks with a buddy of mine who I hadn't seen in a while. So, that was really kind of the origin of American Mash and Grain.
Gotcha. And before I forget, Devin, one of the craft distilleries you worked at was Kings County, correct?
Yeah. At the time, I was working as a tour guide for them. I did go on to eventually become the tour and events manager there for a brief period of time, and I helped them bring tours back during the pandemic in a COVID safe way. And I am operating now as an executive bourbon steward for them, so doing specialty tastings and events. But yeah, that's where I was working at the time.
So just to confirm, there's no more of that oated bourbon available, right?
I wish there was. The oated bourbon has been a piece of sort of Kings County Distillery lore, both outside and within the distillery. It went on sale last week, and I think it sold out very quickly. But I've also heard amazing things about the 7-year-old bottled in bond offerings that they put out there, which I'm very sad to have not gotten my hands on. So anybody who's out there, Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, really cool stuff, and putting out some really interesting older age statement whiskeys now, which is a lot of fun.
I mentioned and bring it up only because, well, two reasons. One, I'm fascinated with any kind of New York City distilling, and Kings County in particular has just, as I say on the podcast a lot, just seeded so many other places across distilling and marketing and retail and all basically every area. But the other reason was that Oated Bourbon, because I was there in August of 2018 for my bachelor week, part of my bachelor weekend, and I got a bottle of the oated whiskey that I think was 100% oats. It was a one-off thing, as a lot of things there are, and it was one of my favorite things. I nursed that 375 for much longer than it should have lasted. So when the oated bourbon came out, I was like, oh, I want to go. But it was also, I had landed from a trip in Kentucky and Tennessee for a week. I had landed the night before at like midnight, got home at midnight, and I was like, I just can't. So I was sad to miss it. I hope someone I know will find me a taster, an ounce or two, but I was glad to see, of course, that it sold out. Anyway, getting back to you guys, to American Mash and Grain. So the website is what I think of as pretty, it's unique, it's well thought out. I think we use the same builder for it too. So because I noticed something that were similar, so which is great for me. It's easy navigation.
We can offline about the difficulties,
yes.
the weird nuances of that website platform.
Yes, a little customization is necessary sometimes. But what I'm really curious about is, as you both said, you went into it with this idea of storytelling. And I know you spoke about a bunch with John about the in-depth level you go to with each distillery that you talk about, the stories you put out. It's not quick blurbs, it's really deep diving into these distilleries. And there is a very clear voice that these come across at. And I'm curious to hear what the process was like getting to the voice of the platform and deciding to bring it to the design and the structure that you have it today.
I think that the evolution of the voice was really getting me to stop writing the articles and hiring Megan Swanson, who's our main writer now. And she's an incredible writer. And just an absolute treat to have on the team. But, early on, when we were trying to figure out what this website is, again, Chase liked this concept of holistic storytelling. Doing like super long form articles wasn't necessarily the goal right out the gate, but as we started to talk with these distilleries, we did find that it was difficult to sort of trim down all of these elements about them into something maybe a little bit more digestible for a consumer base that is becoming shorter and shorter with their attention spans. But I think when we were first putting the website together and we were looking out on the internet at what was being presented when you looked up these distilleries, 95% of it was tasting notes. And if they wrote anything about the distilleries at all, it was maybe a couple sentences or a couple of paragraphs at the most. And nobody was really diving into the who, how, or why, or where about these whiskeys. So I think realizing that we had an opportunity to fill a space or a void that we felt was important to be voiced was probably where the tone and the concept and structure of how our articles are sort of began to unfold. And we, when we're prepping for interviews, we really break it into like 3 parts. It's like history and background. Who are the people who founded this? Where do they come from? How did they find themselves in the industry? Process and philosophy. which is all the like nerdy stuff that people like me, love to dig their teeth into. What kind of still do you have? What is the yeast that you use? Why this varietal of grain? All the like fun stuff that 1% of people care about, but we're here for the, for that 1%.
And this audience is part of that 1% too. So that's a lot of what I talk about. So
yeah. I've been listening, David. I've been catching up. And you do great stuff. And then, yeah, like Chase said, he has this whole brand and marketing approach to it. So, what's cool about it is that we tell you a little bit about where these people come from. We tell you a little bit about how and why they're doing the things they're doing. But then we're also telling you, we're trying to help give you a better idea of how they're telling their story, how they're representing themselves out there. And then we do offer tasting notes at the end. But I actually think the tasting notes end up being slightly more impactful because you've just read all of this backstory into what went into every moment that went into it before that whiskey, hit our palates. And now here's what we think. So that's sort of the genesis of the tone. And then Megan Swanson came in and just made it much better writing than what I was doing before.
Yeah, I mean, Devin covered everything. What I think in hindsight, we've come to appreciate that we maybe didn't know going into it, in the decision, should this be long format, should it be short format? And, it really goes against every kind of, contemporary strategy and content production, right? To go longer and longer and longer, more in depth, because like you lose people's attention span. And I think where Devin and I, have either succeeded or failed, I guess our audience can figure that out in terms of our editing is that these people who are starting craft distilleries are taking such a big risk, right? And they're doing it with such a sense of purpose and drive. And there is this like really in-depth kind of artistry to it all and craftsmanship and entrepreneurial nature to it that we thought to simplify it down or dumb it down to tasting notes or quick hits or like here's your barrel company, here's your toasting, here's 4 sentences about the distillery itself. I think did a greater disservice, right, to everything it actually takes to go into starting these distilleries. And we wanted to kind of pay tribute on the platform to these people in a more complete way.
Totally, I completely get that. I know writing for my own site, I struggle with that same kind of thing. My first couple of quote unquote reviews were just the specs and tasting notes. And then I had a conversation with my friend Lindsay, who was she helped me build out a lot of that site and build out the idea for the podcast and all that. And she said, you need to start writing more about these places. It can't just be the reviews because everyone's writing a review. We're doing a 1-minute video or something. There's got to be more. And looking at some of the distilleries that we both cover, like, Black Button, Frey Ranch. No, sorry, I'm getting Frey Ranch soon. But Black Button, Fort Hamilton, Stolen Wolf, of course, the ones involved with Borrowed Page. Those all came post transformation. So it was when I was really thinking, like, if I'm talking to Greg from Watershed, I want to know, like, how did this start? How did you get from still to still? Why did you choose this grain versus that grain? What's Ohio distilling like? So I get that desire to, I think you put it very well, just to honor the people who are creating these things and make sure their work is not distilled, pun intended, all this work, years of work designing this, distilled down to a 1-minute review where you barely know anything about it other than whether that person likes it. So
yeah. And frankly, I think that's kind of what the craft spirit movement needs, right? Is like everyone knows that the big players in Kentucky and Tennessee spirits, we know who the famous figures are, we kind of know the lore around it, and then that kind of institutional knowledge or kind of it doesn't exist for these small independent startups, and so I think to overlook it, right? We can focus on product reviews and tasting and kind of cliff note stuff for the Kentucky Tennessee things because we already have a base of knowledge, and I think to not put out the Cliff Note versions of these distillery stories is important because they need to build up a kind of a foundation of knowledge around who they are and why they're doing what they're doing.
Plus, if you have a longer conversation with Greg, then you get to learn about Hammerschlagen and a game that involves hitting nails into a trunk of wood with a hammer, and that enriches the whole experience.
Yeah.
Yes,
sure.
That part of the conversation ended up off air because it was just chatting afterwards. But yes, learned about that one for the first time. So this is interesting because this interview is going to be kind of two parts. The first part is really about I guess interviewing the interviewers, throwing it back on you guys, and then of course dedicate some time to Borrowed Page as well, which I'll say now because I'm going to say it later. I loved it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's also been fun because just as of yesterday, I was talking with Whiskey Del Bach for an episode. So before this episode with you guys comes out, I will have had an episode and tastings with all 4 components, which was really important to me because I wanted to understand, what you guys were tasting and then what was going into the blend. So,
and it's important for us too, right? Like to have you, like to hear you say you're thinking about trying to complete the set, so to speak, and that you want to go talk to Whiskey Del Bach. Like so much of what we're doing, right? The mission is to elevate the profile of craft spirits, and like Borrowed Page is an extension of that. And if the product can introduce someone, maybe from Columbus, Ohio, who's very familiar with Watershed to who Whiskey Del Bach is, that's a success. Obviously, we want the product to taste good. We feel that it's a really, it really is a high quality product. But like, it's the conversation, it's the kind of the collaborative nature of it that we're really trying to put out there.
Absolutely. When you were starting the website and thinking about the reviews, and this can be over the course of, really when you started till now, what were some of the sites or podcasts or influencers, if you will, who you look to as examples of what to do or maybe even what not to do? And you don't have to throw anyone under the bus who don't want to. It's just an open question.
No, Whiskey Wash does incredible stuff, right? And Whiskey Wash, I think, is a nice model. I think there's somewhere where we were like, okay, here's somebody who's giving a little bit more lip service to what people are doing, but we felt we could still take things a step further. And Whiskey Wash obviously also covers a lot more landscape of whiskey than us who are focusing within the American craft world. But I admire what they do a lot. And, I think outside of that, it's, for me, stuff that inspired me were, I've been listening to Whiskey Cast with Mark Gillespie for years. He has a big chunk in the middle of his podcast where he interviews somebody and you get to learn a little bit more about what they're doing. Also, just like I could listen to his voice as I fall asleep. It's so soothing and perfect. He actually just reviewed Borrowed Page on his last episode of Whiskey Cast, which was like, I was just listening to it walking my dog. And then it came on and I was like, oh, wow. That was a bit of a surreal moment. Bourbon Pursuit, what Kenny and Ryan are doing, probably was another big inspiration because they were bringing people on. Like, I learned about Charbet in California listening to Bourbon Pursuit. So, and again, they maybe skew a little bit more towards traditional Kentucky bourbon as their main focus, but they were bringing interesting people who were doing interesting things on. So for me, those were inspirations, but still with enough room where I felt like we could do something different than what they were doing.
I really wasn't a whiskey content consumer, right? That was Devin's piece. Like I said, my ambition going into it was really just to reconnect with him, but I'm a consume a lot of storytelling content. And I think of people out there like, I really like, Muse by Cleo. You get some really good behind the scenes information about why people are telling stories the way they are, or Adweek, or things like that. But then I was even really thinking about like, the 30 by 30s, right? It's the last dance with Michael Jordan. Like it is this. We all know who Michael Jordan is, and we don't really know how, like, why he turned out, why he was able to accomplish what he did, or why he was motivated to the extent that he was, or how he trained himself, or how he interacted with people, and this kind of behind the scenes storytelling that provides a lot of rich context to the pieces of Michael Jordan as a brand and as a person that we already know. And I think that's where my motivation was kind of coming into it. And it married really well with Devin's kind of more, traditional whiskey content centric information, but also like his more technical whiskey understanding. And I think it gives it a really unique perspective. Obviously I'm biased, but I think it gives it a unique perspective on the storytelling front for a lot of these distilleries.
I agree. So Devin, I know you've been listening, so you've probably heard this, but I'm a nonprofit fundraiser during the day. And a couple of years ago, there was a shift around the same time. This happened everywhere, really, but there was a shift towards what was called donor-centric fundraising, but it was really about storytelling and telling the story of the organization you're representing better in a more insightful way, in a way that was going to engage with people much more, rather than just going to them and saying, hey, we've got this program, we need money. Which, I mean, in a way is kind of what a lot of whiskey companies do. They're like, we have this product, we want you to buy it. It's the same kind of idea if you really simplify it. And I didn't realize that at the time, but thinking about it in terms of storytelling and making sure these stories were told, and going back a step further, finding those interesting stories became a lot of fun. And that's really why the podcast was born, was because I wanted to talk to people, get those stories, and like this, hear about the two kids who were 5 years old and got benched, and how they ended up here. So one quick question that I wanted to ask before I forget: how did you finally nail down Ari from Mammoth Distilling?
Well, he was kind of connected to us through a mutual friend, Leah Niskanen, who I worked with and for at Kings County Distillery for a while. She introduced me to Ari via email, and I don't know. I mean, it sounds maybe like you've had a harder time nailing him down. To be completely honest with you, he was like, rock and roll, let's do this. And he and Chad hopped on a call with Chase and I like 2 weeks later. So, but truly, like, one of Mammoth, and especially with Ari, like, stewarding their distilling program out there, just some of the coolest stuff that's happening with whiskey right now. And they're so sweet, and Ari and Chad keep telling Chase and I to come up to Michigan to visit them. And there's just been other stuff going on, but as soon as we can possibly get up there, I'm going to accept their hospitality, because they're really great people.
Yeah, the question admittedly was a bit facetious, because I've gotten connected. I even had a phone call with them. We had like a 20-minute phone call, mapped out 4 or 5 episodes during the call, because they're connected with so many different things and have so many pans in the fire. So it's a little bit facetious, because it's been impossible to nail that guy down to be like, let's talk this date. So I will double my efforts.
It's one of my favorite articles that we've ever put on the website, and hands down was the most difficult article to finalize. It was the first time that we ever considered the concept of releasing a 2-part article. And we didn't, because honestly, I don't think it's because we thought it was a bad idea. I think it was like getting a little late in the month, and I was looking around like, we got to get our stuff together, guys. Let's get something on this website. But truly, so much interesting stuff. It was near impossible to edit that article down to something that we felt, even with our long articles, was digestible enough.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say, to start a distillery, right, craft or otherwise, is such an incredible undertaking. to complicate it more, that you want to revive a grain, and you want to grow that grain exclusively on an island like it used to on
Mhm.
national forestry land. So there's all that complicated. You can't get like those guys. If there's an easy path to do anything, they're not taking it. And and I really think that's like when you taste mammoth, we talk about the story, like maybe it's the northern way or up north, right? They always say their product is so enriched by just their philosophy and their mindset of who they are. And again, I think it goes back to like why we really enjoyed having a conversation with them, and why we were so honored to put their story on our website, is because like that context, like you shouldn't be drinking their product without the context of those things, because like what they're doing for the betterment not just of their brand but for whiskey more broadly, and especially in defining what Michigan whiskey is, like it's really unbelievable, and deserves kind of tribute.
Fair. And that touches upon something that I've been considering more in recent episodes and trying to do these mini articles that I do for each of the reviews, is that question of intentionality as context. If you taste something without the context, then how can you, not correctly, but how can you rightly evaluate it? If you hear I'm tasting a rye, just that's the context you're given. Chances are your mind is going to go to probably a 70-year-old something from MGP. That's where so much of the rye is still made on a large scale. And that's what your mind's going to evaluate against. But if you know that, oh, I'm trying this rye that's, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old from this heritage brand that was rebuilt from a couple of seeds on an island, Manitou Island, that puts a different measure in your mind as to what am I tasting here. And I thought about that when reading your Mammoth article, which is both literal and figurative. And I thought about that when reading the Stolen Wolf one as well, because for me, they have those parallel lines where they're also working with Rosen, trying to resurrect these farms, on a larger scale in the farmland, so geographically there, and thinking about getting to taste the Rosen rye right off the still. So I got to do that when I was down at Stolen Wolf, and it doesn't taste like any rye you've ever had. I didn't even think it tasted like a rye, frankly. It's 131 proof, thankfully cooled down, but otherwise right off the still, and it was delicious. But if you drank that, you would never know it was a rye.
I'm jealous, David. You got me. Rosen rye off the still is a bucket list thing right now for me. So, damn you.
Well, you'll just have to fly back from Colorado sometime, and back to, I don't know. I know West Coast has best coast, but back home to the east, the beast of the east,
to the right coast.
To the right coast, yes. So,
I will say, just to kind of riff off what you're saying, is like,
yeah,
that context, right, of who the brand is, why their purpose behind what they do. It's not unique to craft spirits or spirit industry, or even alcohol beverage industries. Like every brand out there is trying to communicate those things, and we live in a world where I think people are more and more trending towards, like, they want to relate with the products they buy or the brands they support, right? And all of that is accomplished through history and context, philosophy and purpose, and things of that. And then, that's kind of why we set it up the way we did. We didn't want to talk about the product without those pieces, because of course we're influenced by them, right? Like, just like if you're drinking any Buffalo Trace product, you're going to be influenced by the fact that they also make Pappy Van Winkle, and that is allegedly the best whiskey, right? Like, those things exist, and we are influenced by them. And we talk to so many craft distilleries that want to think about marketing as like a 4-letter word, right? It's this thing that distracts away from the producing, and it's not really sincere, right? Like, if the product is good enough, you don't need marketing. And every once in a while, we'll stumble across some people who don't have that philosophy. But in my mind is like these are two pieces that enrich one another, right? Like
Mhm.
marketing, if you're selling a bad product, marketing really won't work all that well. But if you have a good product and you can't market, if people can't understand why it's a good product, then you're not going to sell anything either. And so like these craft distilleries are really trying to define without a long history to draw from of how do they communicate who they are and their purpose for doing what they do. And the landscape of like needing to have differentiation in your storytelling is like getting more and more competitive at this moment. And you know, they're like Stolen Wolf is a great example. Like the story behind what they do. Like if you don't want to go just exclusively start drinking Stolen Wolf because of their story, like then I don't know how you're going to be moved. Maybe this is not the industry for you to go down the rabbit hole on, because like same thing with Mammoth. Like if you
Yep.
can't embrace the fact that when you taste their products that you know the hard work and the lengths of their endeavor and the things they are doing to revive their grain and to kind of jumpstart Michigan, craft whiskey, like man, like yeah, I want that to influence me. Like turn that B into a B plus or an A into an A plus, right? Like that's the whole
Yeah.
point of it. And if the net result is me as the consumer enjoys it more, then that's a success.
Look, absolutely. And I know you guys don't. I'm looking at one right now just to make sure that I'm correct on this. Yes. Okay. So I know you guys don't um, rate the whiskeys that you get to try by number. You put the tasting notes, but not the rating. But I have been thinking about this because I do want to put ratings, keep ratings on there for my own sake, because it reminds me, what do I like the most? What do I not? But I've started rating based on the context and the intentionality. Like, is the distiller and the distillery or the producer meeting the goals that they are setting out? Like, are they fulfilling their story? So one like Stolen Wolf, like, yeah, they are. Like that Rose and Rye Alt Distill is a story. The blended whiskey that they have, that's 6-7 years old now, is delicious, and that's its own story as well. Hell, even the few, I think it was called Kindred Spirits bottles that they had that they sourced from MGP, but then held onto for a little bit. That's its own story as well. And if you look at it with that context, it's a big difference. And particularly, I know you guys have spoken, you mentioned it earlier in a different language, but you said part of the platform was to expand the voice of the American craft distilling movement, and that's, as you were pointing out, Jay, is like these places, a lot of them don't have marketing budgets. They're working word of mouth, very local. A couple break out in a big way, but most of the time it's really, Whiskey Del Bach is very open that Arizona is their biggest market. Where they are in Arizona is their biggest market. California and New York are second and third, and they usually are because that's where everything goes after its initial state. Same thing with I was just looking at a bottle Middle West, but also for that matter, Wigle in Pittsburgh. There's another distillery that I'll be talking to in a few weeks. I can't say the name on air yet, but they're also in Pittsburgh. They're hyper local. They've only sent stuff out to a couple of people, and even getting in touch with them is really difficult. But their story is intriguing and fascinating, and part of why I think number one, your guys' interview with John was so really enthralling. I'll use that word, enthralling. And as is the rest of what you do, is that whiskey and spirits is particularly well tuned to storytelling. It's even the heritage brands, this idea that Elijah Craig was the first to char barrels, and it was by accident, to get the fish smell out of a barrel or something. Evan Williams being the first distiller and all this, even though we figured out that the first written record, at least, of whiskey in the Americas was in New York City, or New Amsterdam, really, but you say 1640. So take that, Kentucky. And
yeah, thank you, the Dutch.
Yes, thank you, Dutch. and they knew they needed their spirits.
Well, they knew they couldn't make enough brandy, is what they knew. But
that too, yeah. Um, so yeah, these places are it is incumbent upon those who talk to them, those who try their products and visit to talk about them. And it's something that I think you both clearly, and I hope I also take as a challenge, but also a real honor to, you know, I love going to Kentucky to meet a bunch of people and talking about Fort Hamilton. And knowing that Alex was there the week before I was, and knowing he's going to be back and just pounding that pavement to get the product. And he's between him and Barry Brinegar from RD1. I don't think anyone works harder than those two guys pounding the pavement for their product. But the point of all that being that, because I know I got on a tangent there, was that uh, you're expanding the voice, and in doing so, the idea becomes your storytelling, and the content is more important than brevity.
Yeah.
And
yes,
that comes out with the Mammoth article, with others as well, that it's you don't want to cut that out, because everything you cut out is a part of the story that you lose.
well, and it's like, I think we think of ourselves as storytellers, right? That's what we want the website to be. That's where it came from. I never really thought of the website as a marketing tool or something, as a marketing benefit for these distilleries. But then, we win the double platinum marketing award from the Ascot Awards this year for the website. And, I guess marketing, storytelling, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I mean, everything we do is about making people more aware of the cool things that other people are doing around this country.
Yeah, and you guys get to do it as a pair of friends, which I'll be honest, I do want a co-host or a co-writer or somebody to do that, because pumping out content is rough. But you guys have a great balance, and having I'm sorry, Megan, yes, with you to help write too. Everything comes across as very cohesive and as a passion project, which whiskey, whether you're getting paid for it or not, it ends up being a passion project for all of us. And it's good when that comes through. So I want to keep us moving, because I know I want to keep us to a tight hour and a half if possible. So before we get closer to the borrowed page, one topic that John kind of touched on, but I don't think was answered, was one of the main storylines this fall with whiskey is that finally the American Single Malt has proposed standards of identity. The public comment period, I think, will have ended or is about to end when this episode comes out. And I'm not sure if it was you, Devin, or you, Chase, who said it, but he said there were things that you would have liked to see in the regulations or different in the regulations. And I just wanted to give you a chance to say what those things were.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'm super happy for the American Single Malt Commission and for every distillery that makes an American Single Malt that meets these standards. Standardizing this and having a new style of American whiskey that is, a legal classification for the first time since, I don't want to say it's since 1964, but it feels like that's how long ago it's been. But it's a wonderful time to be alive. It elevates the category, and it will be an incredible boon to the people who make it. And there's still a ton of room for experimentation and innovation. So my personal thoughts and feelings are no knock at all on the incredible hard work that the American Single Malt Commission has done. They should be really proud of themselves, and I'm really happy for them. The only standard that gets to me a little bit, and it's not that I don't understand the reasoning for it, but it's limiting it to malted barley. you know, from one standpoint, I get it. Because if you talk about a malt whiskey pretty much anywhere around the world, we're talking about a barley made whiskey. Scotch, Japan, Ireland, Australia, India, London, anywhere. That's what we're talking about. And if we want American single malt to be its own thing, but also recognizable within the larger context of malt whiskeys, I get making it malted barley. But it does feel a little bit like there's an opportunity here to allow for American single malts to be very definitively and distinctively different than a malt that you could get anywhere else in the world, a malted whiskey. And to eliminate American heritage grains. Like I think about Old Potrero, the 100% rye malt whiskey. Mm-hmm. That with, before the standardization could be considered American single malt. After the standardization, that will no longer be considered an American single malt because it uses rye instead of barley. I've tasted so many really interesting malted corn whiskeys. I really wish that there was more of those out there. A lot of really cool stuff coming out of Mexico specifically. But, I just think we really lost an opportunity to not only standardize American single malt, but allow for it to be something truly American by using grains that are native to our geography and having 100% corn or 100% rye or 100% wheat could just be something really interesting. But there's still American whiskey as a non-category, and so there's still a lot of room for innovation and experimentation. And I'm excited to see what American single malt producers do to push innovation and experimentation within those standards that they helped establish with the TTB.
It all makes sense. I hear the concern. I know, or it's fairly correlative criticism, I think. I hear that because I know others who share the same thought. I don't think we should be worried about the finishing and flavoring comment that was put in the public SOIs or the proposed SOIs. That's not going to go through. But no, I hear you, because if you're creating a category for American whiskey, a whole new class, separate from the 51% class, as I call it. It should be a little different. And there's definitely a lot of those malted grains that are creating something that's we haven't seen before. I mean, I don't know if you've had a chance to try the Big Angus from Copper Sea up here in New York.
No, not yet.
Yeah. So do you know what it is?
I don't.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I know this is audio only, but you looked for a second like there was a little flicker recognition there, so I wasn't sure. Yeah.
Don't give my poker tells away on the podcast, David.
Hey, I got to take something away for poker night. I mean, come on. Just quick side note, you know how long I've been wanting to get a poker game going around here? Seriously.
Man. Next time I'm in town, hit me up. I love poker. I'll come over.
Awesome.
We can't go down that rabbit hole. We could exclusively lose money in the whiskey industry right now. We can't go start funneling it to poker.
No, that's fair. And remember, you have a site, so you're exclusively losing money on that too, most likely, because we all are. So, but anyway, though, I just wanted to put it to you because Devin, because I know I'm so concerned, and now that I'm thinking about it, I think in the white paper that you wrote on on American Mash and Grain, that I think you mentioned it there. So my apologies for missing that note earlier. But the Big Angus green malt from Copper Sea is it's a malted grain, and instead of kilning it to stop the germination process before mashing, they take it green and grind it and mash it there. So it skips the kilning process and basically allows it to continue germinating until it's crushed. So I can honestly say it's one of the maybe two or three whiskeys I've ever tried that I couldn't really give tasting notes on because it was so singular that I had nothing to compare it to.
Wow.
You know, um, I'm not sure even if I liked it. I don't know if I hated it or thought it was one of the most incredible things I've ever tasted. Um, the other one that comes to mind is from Spirits of French Lick, the Whiskey Witch.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have I've talked to Alan about it. I've had other people try it. I don't know what the hell to write for that whiskey because it's just it's different. Like how do you there is no context for that other than the story. You can't compare it. So um anyway, for moving towards the towards Bora page, within Devin, as you were just explaining, this idea that although single malt might be categorized and classified in this particular way, including most things but excluding a certain swath of distilleries, there is this American whiskey category that is a catch-all for whatever doesn't fit within the 51 class, the proposed single malt class, and a couple others like light whiskey. Um, I think light whiskey was the last one that was classified, but I'll double check that. So with American whiskey, you've put it as it's kind of the true bastion of the next unbridled innovation because there is so much you can do with it. Like once you check the boxes for being called a whiskey, grain based, oak, a couple of proof points, like that's all you need. Um, you can really do anything in a way and be able to call it American whiskey. So as you two were thinking about developing Borrowed Page, I was curious which way you came at it from. Were you coming at it as you knew from the start that this was going to be in that category of American whiskey because it would be blending together multiple varieties of whiskey? Or did you kind of have this idea that you wanted to create a blend of whiskeys and it just so happened that you had multiple categories, so it ended up in American whiskey?
Jump in here first because I think Devin was kind of the nail in the coffin on the American whiskey decision. So I'll jump in with the context, or else it'll be a while before I speak again. Um, no, the idea really started with like we wanted to evolve a product out of this storytelling platform. And the idea was that the product was going to be an extension of our mission, right? We wanted to elevate the profile of American craft whiskey. And when you're doing one thing, all right, if you're generating content and that's what you're doing, that's the lane you're in, and you're going to serve the mission well. It's be awesome. But we knew we could make a bigger splash. We knew we could better serve the mission if we evolved that into a product as well, because there's all this ancillary attention and conversation, like the one we're having right now, that spins out of that. Right. So the idea of creating a blend using the distilleries we feature on the website kind of predates this. I don't know if we want to say commitment or the idea of really owning or leaning into American whiskey. But the purpose behind doing the blend was really as an extension of that mission. And then Devin really came in with this. Well, let's make it American whiskey kind of thought process, and I'll let him speak more to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of at some point doing a blend where we got to work with people that we had featured on the website, I think that was an idea we had relatively early on, just when we were thinking, should this thing kind of start to take off, how could we grow it in a way that was within our mission, like Chase was talking about? Honestly, I really do think it was Matt Hoffman from Westland put like a very I don't want to say ominous, but he put this thing on Instagram that sort of tipped everybody in the industry off that the TTB was about to take up American single malt for real. And at that point, I was relatively confident that the standards were going to be what the Single Malt Commission had put together. And I was happy for them But I think that was kind of a little bit of the kick in the pants towards American whiskey, because I had that thought. I was like, wow, okay, American whiskey might be like the last place where you can really mess around with some stuff and be weird, in a way that, I mean, you took the words, I think literally my words out of my own mouth with the unbridled, innovation. But I also think, we had this idea that we wanted to one day release a blend. But that's we stalled out there. That's where we were with it. And I think it's because we were trying to think, all right, well, if we make a bourbon with, Kings County Distillery and Few and, oh my God, I'm blanking on places that we've talked to that make bourbon, probably almost all of them. Highwire. Okay, we could, there's some interesting stuff that you could, it's an interesting bourbon. But all in all, I just think that that idea bored us a little bit. And I think when the idea of American whiskey got into my head, I was thinking, okay, well, if we're blending multiple styles of whiskey together, that means that we could take one distillery that's got bourbon, one that's got rye, one that's got single malt or wheat whiskey or whatever, we could blend them all together. What if we could make a whiskey that, the sum of the parts is great? It is a unique product. It's something different than what anybody has had before. We're becoming a part of the conversation about what American whiskey can be, because that's a big part of the reason why we focus on craft whiskey and the innovation that's happening there, is because for 100 years, American whiskey was one thing. And it was Kentucky bourbon, it was Tennessee whiskey. In the last, 12 years, we've gone from 195 distilleries to over 2,000. And everybody's doing something a little bit different. The concept of what American whiskey can be is going to start to change. And we're really just at the beginning of getting an idea of what that change can be. So the idea that we could blend multiple styles together and create something that was wholly distinctive and different than what anybody had ever tasted before and become a part of that conversation that we were trying to shine a light on was super interesting to me. But then beyond that, I thought, well, if we're really using distinctive styles of whiskey here, maybe in the flavor profile, you can also kind of pick up those notes. And maybe that can be something else that helps us shine the light back on the people that we got the whiskey from. Specifically with Borrowed Page Volume 1, we've got that mesquite smoked single malt in there from Whiskey Del Bach in Tucson, Arizona. That's a distinctive flavor profile. You can pick that up in Borrowed Page. If that's something that interests you, you can find out where that came from, and all of a sudden you're paying attention to Whiskey Del Bach. So when the idea sort of came to me, and then as I started to think about it and talk with Chase through it a little bit more, I think we just realized how aligned the concept was with what our company is and who we strive to be.
Yeah, and I not to belabor the point, right, is the most interesting thing, in my opinion, about craft whiskey that's going on right now is just this exploding notion of innovation. People are taking it in different directions, and we start standardizing more and more and more. You're really going to get what could have been a huge variety of ideas and expressions and regional things, and simplifying it down to a handful of different. Well, you need to fit in these boxes or those boxes, and I think one of the things we love about Borrowed Page is that, and maybe it touches a little bit on your comment about intentionality, David, is like there are people who are doing things that are intentionally not in those molds. And we want to kind of highlight what those people are doing intentionally back to not being in a mold, to really just have a conversation of like, whiskey to be good doesn't need to be 51%, right? It doesn't need to be malted barley. These are the things, and I understand a lot of the value of having kind of these the standardization, right? Because it really helps people understand what it is, and it gives it a platform and a voice. And there's a lot of room to get creative and expand within there. But like, you know, the American single malt movement doesn't happen if everyone wants to just exclusively commit to bourbon, right? And we don't want to miss the next American single malt because people are so exclusively committed to kind of these new standards. And that's what we want to work with, these other craft distilleries to kind of destigmatize to a degree what American whiskey that designation stands for.
Well, and to add one more point to it too, Chase and I have spent over 2 years now talking to these small business entrepreneurs, innovators out there. We've been inspired by them. Their stories are very inspiring. It made us want to aspire to do something new and different and unique as well. And when you're talking to these people, and I remember when we did the feature on Bainbridge Organic Distillery out in Bainbridge Island, Washington. I mean, there's a distillery where their wheat whiskey has consistently won best wheat whiskey at some of the biggest awards, San Francisco World Whiskey Awards, over and over and over again. But within the country that it's made, they're not allowed to call it a wheat whiskey because they distill over 160 proof. It's like, and that's no knock at the TTB or American standards either, but it's like, all right, well, here's something that is being internationally recognized as one of the greatest expressions of this style. And within our own country, we can't call it the thing that it is because of these standards. And so, yeah, I think stuff like that inspired us to go color outside the lines.
Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you've been taking advantage of that podcast-only code for the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. They've got around 20 bottlings coming out each month, and there's never a shortage of new things to explore. This month's focus, their October distillery dive, is Distillery number 5. This famous lowland distillery will show you something completely different, and you've probably never had before. This isn't your floral and fruity Speyside, but it's also not that smoky, sometimes medicinal, and maritime Islay. It's truly unique and in a category and region all its own. The Distillery Dive bottlings were announced on October 11th, so you might still find some available. If not, keep an eye out. There are always more bottles coming from this distillery and others, and always new journeys to explore. There are also currently 5 fall bundles available, packaging multiple bottles together from sometimes the same and sometimes different distilleries into a discounted set for you to discover. Remember to use the promo code WRP for 20% off your annual membership, and you can visit the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society website to sign up and order via the link in the show notes. It makes sense, and one need look no farther than Scotland. I think it is the best example for what happens when you overregulate. It's one thing to say, if the Scotch Whisky Association, the SWA, had said that if you want to make a single malt or malt whiskey, it has to be this way. But it's gotten to a point where if you want it to be called Scottish whiskey or Scotch, it has to be this way. And as a result, they may make a lot of great whiskey, but that's the only type of whiskey that is being made there, because nothing else can be called whiskey, or not easily, certainly. A couple others being, Ireland is similarly. I don't think it's as powerful. Colin from Kings County might disagree after the letter he got about that Irish style whiskey.
I think he certainly disagrees.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But recently I got to try Waterford from there, and it's an Irish whiskey by nature of being in Ireland, but it's an Irish whiskey that's in the style of a Scottish single malt, and it tastes much more like a single malt Scotch than it does what you would think of as an Irish whiskey. Whether you want to go Jameson, Bushmills, or Cooley, I guess, in between. So there is that delicate balance to be had. And to your point, Devin, about Bainbridge in particular, and that overclassification, I just talked about this with Whiskey Del Bach, and this is something that Amanda Paul, Stephen's daughter, had said that, I want to make sure I get this quote right because it was a really good quote, and I'd like to get those right. So she said that she preferred reviews to awards because there's more engagement and discussion leading to greater knowledge of the product. And to that point, Bainbridge, maybe they could be the most awarded wheat whiskey ever if they wanted to, or if they kept entering awards. But as you said, in your own country, you can't be called that, and I don't even think they're really widely known, or certainly not as widely known as they should be in their own country. And it's because there's just not enough discussion about them. And the more we talk about them, the more we talk about the Whiskey Del Box, the Watershed, all these different distilleries, they get more knowledge and people know more about them and can say, all right, I don't really care that we can't call them a wheat whiskey. I understand that they intend it to be a wheat whiskey, so that's why I'm going to try it. Middle West, I've told the story before, but I didn't particularly like their wheat whiskey at first. It was fine, but as a lot of wheat whiskeys can be, I found it a little one note. But then in talking to Ryan Lang there, he said, don't think of it as a wheat whiskey the way you would a Bernheim or a Woodford wheat whiskey. Think of it as a wheat whiskey in the style of a single malt. 95% wheat, 5% malted barley, but it's designed to be more like a single malt just made with wheat. And that completely changed my review of it, my notes, what I was picking up, because that's what they were going for. And that's more important. And that circles back to the intentionality. Like once you talk to these people and you know what they're trying to get at and provide that context, it's so much better for the consumer. And for even if it's 5% of consumers or 1% of consumers that really look at these things and really try to find more information, that's the 1 to 5% who are going to pick up these products and talk about them with their friends and slowly but surely get out there. So, all right. So I know we are running a bit long, so I want to make sure we get good time for the product itself. Thankful to do. Could go to each of the bottles involved or products involved and say, oh, okay, I get this in this blend. So how do you feel you balance the locality with the ultimate blend?
Exceptionally well. I mean, just as
that's what I was looking for. That's the answer I was looking for.
No, I mean, I'm super proud of what's in the bottle for volume 1. And I also think that, through luck or fate or whatever, we ended up with the right distilleries to partner with for this first whiskey. It's big, it's bold, very robust, super flavorful, starts off a little bit like a bourbon. So, the nose for me is super inviting. When we were blending, it was the first thing that all of us kind of perked up about when we got our nose into this version of the blend. And I should mention, Chase and I blended this, but we also had the help of Ann Dimick, who we met when she was working at Watershed Distillery. She's an incredible whiskey mind, an incredible person, super helpful from kind of the very early beginnings of this project all the way through blending, and has a ton of blending credits to her own, to herself. We were getting close to the point where we knew we had to put this thing together, and I started to get a little bit nervous that Chase and I had never blended anything ever before. Mm-hmm. So I reached out to Ann, and we were lucky that she was super into it and wanted to jump on. So Ann was with us every step of the way as we blended this product, which was invaluable. But the nose was the first thing that jumped out to us. Super inviting. It's a high proof whiskey. I mean, we're talking 58.4% alcohol, but you get your nose in there. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. If this is your first crack of an alcohol bottle today and you shove your nose in there, this thing's gonna get you. So, advisory label, warning. But for such a high proof whiskey, it really doesn't scare you off. And there's so much wonderful sweetness and a little bit of spice there on the nose, but it's just it draws you in. And that was the first thing that sort of popped out to us. When you go to taste it, I think the bourbons really sing up front, which I'm hoping will help, bourbon drinkers appreciate the entry into this whiskey, because it doesn't stay in that bourbon lane for super long. But you get all these really wonderful sweet vanilla notes, caramel notes, butterscotch notes right up front. I attribute a lot of that to Watershed's bourbon, which is made in a really traditional style on a column still. It's a light bourbon, but super sweet, really flavorful, really approachable. I think a lot of the Spirits of French Lick bourbon is in there too, and that gives it a little bit more heft, a little bit of spice, and certainly I think the mouthfeel owes a lot to the Spirits of French Lick bourbon, because in the Lee Sinclair bourbon that they make out there in Indiana, they use oats in the mash bill. And oats tend to give whiskeys a little bit more of a velvety or silky texture on the palate. And I think it's what helps this whiskey drink so easily at, almost 117 proof. It's dangerous how easy it is to drink this whiskey, I think, at this proof. And I think that we owe a lot of that to the Lee Sinclair bourbon out of Spirits of French Lick. Then all these beautiful kind of spicy notes come in right through the middle for me. And again, everybody's, palates are different. So everybody's going to have a different experience with this. But I do hope I'm incepting everybody just a little bit who's listening to this podcast here this evening. But you get these beautiful
I've already
spicy...
written my notes, so you're not going to incept me. So go ahead.
You get these beautiful spicy notes. I think, the Lee Sinclair opens that door. I think Wigle walks through it. All these beautiful black pepper and cinnamon notes. But because Wigle has no corn in their rye, it's a rye, wheat, and barley mash bill, there's a certain softness to their rye as well that I think allows for some stone fruit kind of flavors to come through in that mid palate, to sort of play with the spice, to be a nice transition note from the vanillas and caramels that the bourbons give you up front. And then all of these flavors are kind of sticking with you. And then that mesquite comes in, that mesquite smoke. You get some malty notes from the barley, but that mesquite smoke comes in. And what I love about it personally is that I feel like it changes everything. Suddenly those vanilla and stone fruit notes I was getting, the mesquite comes in, and now it's barbecue sauce. Those peppery and spicy notes, now it's brisket. And it, the mesquite comes in and just changes everything. And it's got a really great, long, complex finish on it too. Then you get your nose back in there after tasting it. Some of that smoky mesquite comes through on the nose as well. So, I'm so tempted to do a little Ghostbusters, quote, call it fate, call it, luck, call it karma. But I think that the three of us were really able to get these four distillates together, blend them in a way that truly creates an experience that's unlike something that I've tasted before, and shows off the best elements of the four whiskeys that we did in a way that I think people can really appreciate. So I think we did well. I mean, you like it, David. So that's the goal. At the end of the day, the goal is just to hope that people like it.
No, I do really like it. And I think to circle back on what you said about the appeal, particularly to bourbon drinkers, or those who think American whiskey is bourbon, like all bourbon. I know at 700 something bottles, this isn't meant to be like, the maker's mark on everybody's bar or every back bar at every bar. But that being said, for those who do taste it, I thought it was perfectly designed for getting people to experiment and go a little outside of their comfort zone. The bourbon, and I think some rye producers have done this as well, where the bourbon influence, corn in the rye case, to kind of get into the mash bill, invites people in. You get the sweetness that you associate with bourbon. And hell, I've had international listeners tell me they don't drink bourbon because it's too sweet. For me, there was a time where Wild Turkey was too spicy. So I don't know where I land on that But um, but the point being that bourbon can be very sweet, and then you get to roll in with the rye, which is spicy, but as you said, it's a Monongahela style, but it's not like punch you in the face, black pepper kind of rye. And then using the whiskey tabak with the mesquite smoke, a smoke which is not typical of American whiskeys, of bourbons and ryes, but it's familiar because, as you said, barbecue, wood smoke. It's not peat, it's not vegetal, it's all smoke. Which it reminds me of barbecue, and it's also an American thing, that barbecuing tradition. And lastly, too, there because there's relatively such a small percentage of the whiskey Delbach in there, it's 10% of the blend. The smoke is very subtle, subtle to the point where if you didn't have the context necessarily or didn't know, you could maybe attribute it to the smokiness you get from barrel char, which in and of itself may not be exactly what you were looking for, but it'll be something familiar to American drinkers who are used to drinking things that had to be in a new charred oak barrel. So they're always getting a little bit of barrel char, hopefully, and getting a little smokiness in there. So in that way too, I thought it was just a good idea to expand people's horizons a little bit and get them to explore. And clearly with the sample that was sent to me, I've made a good dent in there. So um, yeah, I have quite enjoyed it. So you did mention this already, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it, which is this idea that, and I am throwing a lot of your words back at you because they were good words, and I like you to do that you won't just work with anybody. And for me, it reminded me a lot of Lost Lantern. And they were a guest a couple of episodes ago. Still talking with them, and Adam and Nora are great to talk to about finding these smaller distilleries and showcasing them through, in their case, through single barrels, and as of now, one blend, though I know more are coming, thankfully. So it did remind me of that, just in the sense of really being picky. You want to expand people's palates. You want to introduce them to new distilleries, new types of whiskey. But at the same time, you have to know that there's reluctance, there's any number of hurdles in getting people to try new things and try new whiskey styles. And so you got to kind of ease them in and figuring out those distilleries that are good gateways to doing so, which I think, all of these I would consider as great gateway whiskeys into trying new things, is a perfect example of that. One, actually, I did want to ask specifically, because I don't remember seeing this on your website. Had you guys talked already to Santa Fe Spirits?
No. I would love to talk to God, it's Colin.
Colin, yeah.
Colkeegan. Yeah, Colkeegan.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to break the name apart. And then
Sure.
I think we would love to. Whiskey Del Bach was the second ever feature on the website.
Right.
And since they both do the mesquite smoked malt thing, it's just taken us a while to kind of circle back around to Santa Fe, but it's a conversation that I think we'd love to have.
Absolutely. Colin was great. He's been a great resource as I've been researching these American single malts too. But as soon as I was interviewing Whiskey Del Bach, and the mesquite part, had to go back to that. But then I was wondering, had you talked to them, because that could have been another mesquite single malt, a mesquited single malt to add in there. And delving a little bit into that, Santa Fe smokes 30% of their malt is mesquited. I know Whiskey Del Bach does it differently. They've got the classic that's unsmoked, and then the Dorado, which is mostly, and then has a little bit of classic in there to cut the smoke. When you guys received the samples, again, I'm not sure which one of you said this. I wasn't sure the voices at the time that I wrote that I was writing this note, but one of you were kind of very devoted to which Whiskey Del Bach expression you wanted and how you wanted it. including, you got samples that were 100% mesquite smoked. So what had you kind of figure out what level of smoke was going to be appropriate, and which variation of whiskey del Bach to go with?
Well, I think we both wanted the same thing. I was maybe more bullheaded about it, but I'll let Chase talk about how we sort of came around to the level that we have in the blend.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing I don't think we appreciated when we started out, how much a little goes a long way when it comes to smoked, grain smoked whiskey. The way we started is Devin, Ann, and I each kind of we created our notes. We profiled all the barrel selections that we got. Now, mind you, this is mid COVID, so all of this is virtual. Everything we got duplicate samples across. We would love to go be in person, but obviously, like, it was just not an option for us. So it was a logistical challenge. So we started with, let's taste everything. Let's rank order. Let's create kind of the unique notes barrel to barrel. And then step one was, all right, I would make a blend of my favorites across all the distilleries. Devin would make a blend of his favorites across distilleries. And I think both Devin and I, if I remember correctly, really gravitated towards, on an individual tasting note basis, that more heavily smoked, right? It was a big identifiable flavor, so good. But as soon as we started blending it in, it just became so overpowering. And so through the blending process, we actually scaled back, and then we ultimately went to the unsmoked, and we didn't really like that, so we moved back and forth. I think that was really, looking back at it, probably the hardest piece for us to kind of balance in there was the right amount of smoke, of the Del Bach samples. I don't know, Devin, if you have any other comments about that process.
No, I mean, we're in the middle of the blend, and we've got this concept that everybody that we've spoken to is so enthusiastic about. And I cannot overstate the level of enthusiasm that we got for the idea across the board, whether it be the distilleries or like Imperial Packaging, where we get our bottles from, or even Tappy, where we got the toppers. Everybody was super into the idea, but here we are mid blend, and now it's time to like put up or shut up. You got to actually do proof of concept here. So, I mean, I think Chase and I both really like the heavily smoked thing, but also I was just kind of like, if this is going to work, we've got to have it, like it's got to be in there. And in reality, it just didn't work with the 100% smoke. So we ended up with something that's a little bit closer to the Dorado that they released themselves, which is a blend of smoked distillate and classic distillate. And yeah, I mean, when you're dealing with smoke, it's really tough. Like Chase said, a little bit goes a long way. So finding that right balance where I wanted the smoke to be there, but I also wanted it to kind of work as a frame in which the other flavors could live within. And I think we found the version that made that happen.
Yeah, and I think one learning curve throughout this, right, is blending is a bit tough, because like when you want to make something a bigger flavor profile, or if you want to mute it a little bit, it's not just adding or detracting, subtracting that piece that you want to increase or decrease. It's a little bit, sometimes you need to decrease a little bit of the rye. If it's too peppery, maybe that's what's blocking out the mesquite smoke, or maybe the mesquite smoke and the rye are blocking out the sweetness, and sometimes it can be quite counterintuitive, right? Like, if you're trying to get the smoke to stand out, it's not necessarily add more smoke. It's maybe balance it in with a little bit more sweetness, or downplay a little bit of that peppery notes. So there's not so many big clashing flavors back to back in the mid to late palate. And I think through the iterative process I don't even know how many different versions or blends that we created. It was a ton. We were running out of liquid at the end. But what we realized is, like, you got to think, well, what is the end goal? Like, how much smoke do we want in there? What is that right balance? And then what are all the different ways we can go about accomplishing that, whether it's dialing back some of the other flavors or dialing up some of the smoky flavors. And it really was a huge learning curve. And that smoke was such a big wild card for us to try and figure out. And I think we nailed it, right? I think we found that sweet spot of you can taste it, it's there, but it's also not going to like turn people away from this product, right? It's that nice central balance of the different kind of whiskeys we have in there.
Absolutely. And it's funny that I know we're spending a lot of time, oddly enough, talking about the smallest proportion in there, but instead, as you both said, the smoke goes a long way, so it can punch above its weight, and it does have a really big impact. And I, with the time that we have left, I also want to talk a little bit more about that Lee Sinclair. So I totally agree with you. The oats just have a thing, and I know we talked about the oats earlier, so I'll let the oat beer bourbon go. But the I've learned I don't stay salty about FOMO for too long at this point, because I know there's just more whiskey than anybody could drink, so I'll get over it. But one of the things that came out from from Devin, your interview when you went on with Alan's Instagram, was that it wasn't a classic Lee Sinclair that you ended up going with. It was a 64-gallon Bordeaux barrel instead. So that was the one component that I realized after the fact, that like I can try the classic Lee Sinclair and I've got a barrel pick of it from Spirits of French Lick, but I don't have the one from that was aged in a Bordeaux barrel. So when I was tasting the whiskey and writing out my notes, there was a very clear, as much as there was the stone fruits, which you both mentioned earlier, there was also a more vinous quality as well, a little bit of that wine, and maybe it was just a touch of the Bordeaux in there, which I know is kind of a part of a part of a part, so call it what it is. But I did kind of have that come across as a little bit different in there, and it added a richness and an unctuous undertone to it as well. So when you were blending, I know he said Spirits of French Lick sent you the most samples. What led you to choosing this Bordeaux barrel Lee Sinclair versus a classic one?
Well, I think important to note that we had no idea that it was a Bordeaux barrel. He didn't tell us that. We did. I mean, I guess like, in retrospect, a little bit of like reverse, engineering. You can see that it's a 64-gallon barrel on the like written on the bottle. So that's obviously not like a 53. So there's something else going on there. But he didn't tell us. Laurelin from Spirits of French Lick didn't tell us. Like I said, it was written there. The 64 gallons was written there on the sample, but probably as distracted as we were by just the immense task that was in front of us, I had no idea. We had no idea. And
well, one thing I'll say about the Spirits of French Lick, and I don't know if it was just Alan kind of being the alchemist that he is and wanting to just throw a bunch of curveballs. But it was the one that right out the gates, there was the least consensus, right, between Ann, Devin, and myself, which meant that like as we're trying to go through all the variations of like my number one, Watershed with Devin's number one, number two, Spirits of French Lick, so on and so forth, trying to create logic to the whole blending process, like it created maybe the most chaos in terms of how many iterations we need to go through, because like the range was wildly different for their products, and it was all so good. But I think what we ultimately came down to is Spirits of French Lick plays such an important role of tying everything together in my mind, right? Like the Watershed is that really relatable front end anchor of a bourbon. Obviously, the Wigle Monongahela Rye is that mid note, that kind of peppery piece, and then you end, in my opinion, with the smoke in the back end. But Devin talks about Spirits of French Lick as like the texture that runs through it. It's this kind of like ambiguous middle ground that is both sweet and kind of odd and interesting and unexpected in a lot of ways that brings you kind of across the pieces. And I think once we settled on, I think that might have been the last barrel we really settled on, but once we settled on that particular barrel pick as the one, it almost felt like, the linchpin, right? The stuff that made everything else kind of click into place. And I don't know if I can explain it more than that, because like Devin said, we didn't know what it was going into it, so we couldn't rationalize our thought process. It really was just sensory.
I mean, it's okay. I think that might even work in your favor in this case. I know we've talked a lot about intentionality and knowing the context, but in this case, it sounds like not knowing the context may have worked even better, to just be like, what's the best thing that's going to taste the best in this blend? And I absolutely would not put it past Alan to throw you like, six. If he threw you 5 samples, it would be 4 regulars and 1 way out there, because he would totally do that.
Yeah, I think it was like 4 and 2 or something. I think there was 2 wild cards in there. We chose, I think, one of the wild cards. I think intentionality is really important, because like I know we talked about it a bunch, but like there was so much intention into who we selected to participate in this, and also like the relationships we cultivated going in, right, which is going to influence what barrels they send us, and how the concept of the project itself, what they think might be a good addition. Like you can plan it out, and you can make it as logical or rational as possible, but like at the end of the day, whiskey is an art, right? It's something we do for emotion. It's something that appeals to maybe not exclusively the logical side of our brain. And I do kind of like this. You can be so intentional, so planned, so regimented up to a point, and at some point you gotta kind of take your hands off the wheel and say, all right, we're going to put a blindfold on, and we're going to go figure out what is the best option that's in there. And it's going to go purely off instinct. We're going to try again, and we're going to keep making new blends. We're going to keep resampling the same blend over and over and revisiting it. And it is quite an exhaustive process. This kind of, I don't know, less logical, less structured piece of it all. But I think you need to balance the art and science of this process, just because that's the nature of whiskey.
I think you put it pretty damn well, Devin. I don't know if you got anything to add to that, but that was
Chase. I'll let Chase always is the one that hits hard with the great sweepingly moving statements. So I'll leave it there with him.
He's leaning into that the Jersey power right there.
It's the marketing and storytelling, right? If you don't know the answer, just bullshit your way through it in a kind of an evocative way.
I got to tell you, it's the same damn thing in fundraising too. So I know exactly what you mean. Truly do. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time tonight to talk about, your platform, the website, how that was built, how Borrow Page came about. I know you've got a little more left of volume 1. I'm going to try to grab one myself. And that the list for volume 2 is evolving, but I know you guys are thinking about it already. So there will be a volume 2 for this. And I'm very excited to see what that's going to be as well.
And the quick plug on that, not to interrupt, right? The goal of Borrow Page is to be entirely different, expression over expression, right? We want to tell a totally different story. We want to feature totally different distilleries. It may not even be 4 distilleries. It may not be a bourbon, right? We don't necessarily it's not a mold we're trying to adhere to. It's all about, we want to feature and help elevate the profile that the people we think are doing great work, and we want to release a great product that'll help in that, to that end, right? Is to introduce more people to their product and appreciate what they're doing.
Perfect. And I think it's getting a little, Return of the King here, but we got a couple endings, but they're all really good endings, so it's perfect for me. So guys, hang on with me for a minute after we finish recording, just to close out a few things. But in the meantime, where can people find American Mash and Grain and Borrow Page?
The same place. So come to our website, which is mashandgrain.com. So that's mash, the letter N, grain.com. can also follow us at Mash and Grain on pretty much every social platform. Borrowed Page is exclusively sold on our website as of right now. It's available in 40 states across the country. It's retailing at $75 a bottle, which means that with tax and shipping, you're going to be able to get this whiskey for under $100, which is what we were trying to aim for. Just over 700 bottles were produced, and like Chase said, as sad as it makes me to say, honestly, the more and more I drink it, we will never recreate this specific whiskey again. Once Volume 1 is gone, it's gone. Volume 2 is going to come out sometime next year. Completely different distilleries, completely different whiskeys, a very different expression. So get it while you can. We hope you like it. Check out the articles and give us a follow. Whiskey's about stories, and we like to tell them. So check us out.
And lastly, final plug from the sales guy. If you buy 4 or more bottles, you get free shipping. So don't be afraid to buy in bulk.
Definitely. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much. I'll put all the links that you mentioned in the show notes to the website, to social media, to the buying page as well. I'm glad to see New York is one of those 40 states, so no problem there. And with that, we'll close out another episode of the Whiskey Green Podcast. Make sure to follow, subscribe, rate and review on any podcast app of choice. If I'm not on one, first off, not sure how you're listening to me, but if I'm not on one and you really want me to be, just let me know. And I will see you next week.